Hello. Cyberterrorism is at the top of the minds of security professionals, politicians, and many others. But is the threat real? Does it vary across regions? And how does it differ from other security threats, if at all? To discuss these questions and to discover what businesses can do about cyberterrorism, I spoke to a range of IT industry executives and analysts. Let's talk cyberterrorism. Whether state-sponsored or driven by individuals, it's a huge threat. Clearly, governments and militaries are worried, and so are their contractors. But why should the typical business care about cyberterrorism?
I think the typical business should be worried about all types of cyber threats, and cyberterrorism is it's an emerging threat, but I think as yet it's not providing a significant board-level concern. I think if you look at the evolution of cyberterrorism, it's gone from enabling activities like propaganda, finance, recruitment, online presence, all the way through to sort of disruptive activities that relate to takeovers, use of of social media platforms to promote activities, as we've seen in New Zealand recently, all the way through to the destructive threaten to life and infrastructure. And what I don't think we've seen is the threat evolve into that destructive layer as yet. And I think it's right to be concerned and to think about that as an emerging threat. However, cybercrime, the financial aspects to it, recruitment, and those disruptive elements, DDoS and other things, are significant and are only going to increase.
Well, I think they should care about it because it's another attack vector that can impact their business. Whether a cyber terrorist wants to target a particular state, a particular nation, some of the byproduct of that impacts corporate business, public and private business. So we've seen examples where state-sponsored attacks attributed to countries have impacted businesses more profoundly than the actual targets. So I think they just got to see it as another threat that acts in a similar way, but perhaps with different motivations. And they also need to understand whether inside their organisation they have assets that could be a target for cyber terrorism as well. So it's clearly if you've got critical infrastructure, but maybe if your business is affiliated with organisations or has assets that could be a target. To really understand that, I think is key in terms of looking at that threat.
I think the biggest thing is everybody's a target, but even if you don't think you're a target from a cyber terrorism perspective, perhaps the partners that you work with are, perhaps the infrastructure that your business relies on is, and so any number of cyber terrorism attacks have the potential to dramatically impact your overall business.
What about regional differences? How is the Middle East and Europe region different from Asia Pacific or North America?
In general terms, it's not different at all. The phenomenon is global, and the groups that would attack IT systems are also globally distributed. There's no real one single country or region where it comes to. There are frequent, at the level of cyber warfare, attacks taking place, and often governments and media will talk about this has originated in North Korea, and there are certain countries that tend to get accused more of this type of attack going on. In terms of the enterprise or governments, the Europeans, Middle East and Africans are more or less in the same boat when it comes to the types of threat they're facing. There might be a difference in intensity of attacks, and it can be geopolitical. So, for example, the Middle East is currently more challenged with stability. There are a number of conflicts there, the same for certain parts of Africa, not all of Africa. So the intensity, severity of attacks, cybercrime could be increased in those regions. From the Asia Pacific side, they tend to be slightly behind the curve in terms of adopting technology compared to probably the US market is advanced Europeans fairly advanced too, and the Asia-Pacific markets tend to be slightly behind in terms of cybersecurity. But more or less the challenges are quite global in nature, and the companies that need to protect themselves are all in the same boat, more or less.
I think the difference really is not necessarily on the types of things that are happening from a cyberterrorism perspective. What changes, I think, perhaps is who are the threat actors in the different regions. And so EMEA has a different set of threat actors perhaps than you would in Asia Pacific or even in North America. And so it's really thinking through from a risk assessment standpoint, who are those threat actors? What is their likely objective, and how would you think through mitigating those objectives as part of your risk assessment plan?
Comparing cyber terrorism to other types of attacks, such as profit-seeking hacking, hacktivism and disgruntled insiders, how from a technical perspective does cyber terrorism look different from other types of attacks?
I think all of those, we're talking about different attacks, different attack vectors, different threats. I think for an organization, understanding the different adversary groups, their particular motivations, the tools and methods that they use, is very useful in helping define your external risk environment. However, it probably doesn't hugely help you when you're putting in place the internal controls and processes and developing a robust and secure and resilient organization. And I think organizations have fallen into the trap of really fixating externally on all of these weird, wonderful and destructive adversaries without thinking first about what they need to achieve, their own assets, taking an inside-out approach rather than that reactive external view.
Going back to the assets, I think, understanding if you've got assets that could be a target, but really it just needs to be seen as another threat in that wider threat landscape. And you just need a robust security program based on the assets that are in your organization, and also the impact that could be from an incident around those assets. So if a service, a site, a piece of data was stolen, misconfigured, or changed, what would be the impact to that? And that would be the start point to understand if that type of threat was to hit you, how can you mitigate that? So your security controls and your program need to be aligned to the impact of those assets.
Do evolving types of cyber defences, such as cloud-based security or AI-enhanced tools, work against cyber terrorism?
I believe that they do. I think the technology is there to counter the threats that are both in place today but coming. But one of the discussion points that's been really interesting to explore is, so if artificial intelligence is going to help the Chief Information Security Officer protect the assets, the network, the infrastructure, the revenues, the data, surely the same AI technology can be used by the criminals. So that I believe there's very much it's cops and robbers, it's cat and mouse, and it's the same paradigm as ancient days. If you build a lock, and as soon as you put the lock on the door and then go on holiday, people will try to start breaking that lock. The ones that will be most successful, probably ones that build locks, because that's the insider threat. The other thing is, if you have a padlock and you don't push it all the way down so that it clicks, it's actually not quite locked properly. And we know, and it's been spoken about today many times, when enterprise security is compromised, it's because somebody made a mistake. Just a simple human error, not intentional, something hasn't quite been configured properly. So, the advice really is to have a multi-layered security approach. Joe from VMware spoke a lot about preventative, and I entirely agree with that. There's a lot of investment in reactive, but not quite so much attention to the preventive side of security, which should be changed. But then that basic point of following policy. Those policy guidelines are in place for a reason. If they're not followed, then cracks will appear in the security.
They're part of the solution, but also they're part of the problem. So, don't forget, these cyber terrorists are using AI that they're already using those techniques and technologies. They're using automation, they're using bots. So in some ways they're ahead of us, right? We all know that there's countless technologies coming into the market. We all know that everyone's migrating to the cloud. Our DBII report shines a light on the fact that vulnerabilities over the last 12 months have risen dramatically in that cloud space. And it's not saying that the technology is wrong, it's just saying that the target from the attackers has moved into that space naturally as those assets have migrated into cloud environments. So yes, they can be part of the solution, and good configuration is key there, because again, when you break down that data, the largest percentage of those data breaches and incidents are caused by misconfiguration. So as organizations scramble to get the benefits of cloud, having misconfigured systems is clearly an output of that speed and that haste to realize the benefits.
Sure. Just like they're effective against any other type of cyber intrusion. Effectively, you're looking for the same types of tools and the same types of techniques that people are using for cybercrime, but now they're using it for just a different objective. The way they get into the network originally typically comes through some sort of endpoint, perhaps a phishing email. Once you get access, you try to raise your privilege or escalate your privilege, and then move laterally within the network and find a target.
What advice do you have for enterprises who are concerned about cyber terrorism? What should they be doing right now?
I think that the single piece of advice would be, it's very important to understand the threats facing your business and understand the motivations, so you can ascribe a risk level to external attackers. It's just as equally as important to understand what your organization is doing and how it might respond and be resilient in the face of a major criminal attack, a nation state intrusion, cyber terrorism or hacktivism. And fixating on external threats, I think, draws the attention away and creates a very reactive mode rather than saying, I can control what I have and how I operate. And that's really the best way to do it. I don't believe that traditionally banks focus on bank robbers. They focus on how secure the bank can be and how they can protect the investments of their members.
In a nutshell, there's two parts to it. One is technology, which is there. Two is organization. It's an organizational change is possibly more important than the tech part, because the tech part is available. If you understand what you need and pay for it, you will get support for that. It could be fully managed service. Those options are out there. The organizational side, the recommendation really is to have executive buy-in, to have the C-level suite part and party to all the discussions and decisions about how to secure the business. So that executive level buy-in and through all the business units, everybody understanding together and working together to have that security sufficient is the key, I think.
It's a changing feast. Your assets changed, the controls need to change, and your response needs to change in line with all of that. So it's a difficult challenge.
So it would seem that cyber terrorism outcomes are not that different from those of other security threats. What differs is the motives of the threat actors, and in many cases the types of attack they may well mount. And what's certain is that this is a problem that's unlikely to disappear.